My mother said I'd never be like my perfect brother. She was right for the wrong reasons. I stood in the corner of my parents' living room, the smell of roasted turkey turning my stomach. My mother clinked her crystal glass, a wide, fake smile plastered on her face as she looked at my brother, Julian. To Julian, she announced, her voice dripping with pride. Our golden boy, a future CEO. Then her eyes darted to me, taking in my worn leather jacket, and her smile turned into a sneer. And to Caleb, well, maybe one day you'll learn to dress like a respectable adult. I just smiled back, my jaw clenched tight, because in exactly 10 seconds the doorbell was going to ring. And the man standing on the other side of that door was about to tear her precious, perfect world into a million little pieces. Thank you for being here. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and listen as I tell you the whole story. The heat in that living room was suffocating. It was Thanksgiving, the kind of picture-perfect American holiday my mother, Evelyn, lived for. The kind where she could parade her family in front of the neighbors, the relatives, and anyone else who would pay attention. The dining table was set with her best china, the silver polished so bright it hurt your eyes, and the centerpiece was a massive, golden brown turkey that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But beneath the smell of rosemary and roasted meat, there was something else in the air, something rotten. I stood leaning against the archway leading into the kitchen, keeping my distance. I had my old, beaten-up leather jacket on over a black t-shirt. I knew it drove her crazy. I wore it on purpose. It was my armor. Across the room, my brother Julian was holding court. He wore a tailored navy suit that cost more than a used car, a silk tie, and a smile that he had practiced in the mirror since he was a teenager. He was holding a glass of expensive wine, laughing loudly at a joke our Uncle Matthew had just told. My mother tapped her spoon against her crystal glass. The sharp clinking sound cut through the chatter, and the room went dead silent. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood up, smoothing down her immaculate dress, her eyes shining with tears she could summon on command. Family, she started, her voice trembling just the right amount to show how deeply moved she was. We have so much to be thankful for this year, but most of all, we are thankful for Julian. She reached out and rested her hand on Julian's shoulder. He looked down modestly, playing the part of the humble genius perfectly. Julian has just informed us that he is in the final stages of securing an executive position at one of the biggest tech firms in Silicon Valley. Our golden boy, a future CEO. He has worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and now the world is finally recognizing his brilliance. The relatives clapped. Aunt Clara wiped a tear from her eye. My father, Robert, stood next to my mother, puffing his chest out like he had personally built Julian's success with his bare hands. Then the clapping died down. My mother's eyes slowly drifted across the room, past the smiling faces of my aunts and cousins, until they landed on me. The warmth vanished from her face instantly. Her lips thinned into a hard, white line. And to Caleb, she said, her tone dropping 10 degrees. The entire room shifted uncomfortably. Well, we are thankful you decided to show up. Maybe one day you'll learn to dress like a respectable adult, instead of a mechanic who just crawled out from under a truck. But we love you anyway. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Julian looked at me and offered a tight, patronizing little smile. The kind of smile you give a stray dog. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I just smiled back at her. A slow, calm smile that I knew she couldn't understand. My jaw clenched tight. I shoved my hands deeper into my jacket pockets, my fingers brushing against my phone. I knew what time it was. She thought she had won. She thought this was the peak of her life, the moment her golden boy was crowned king. But I knew the truth, because in exactly 10 seconds the doorbell was going to ring. And the man standing on the other side of that heavy oak door was about to tear her precious, perfect world into a million little pieces. To understand how we got to this explosive moment, I have to take you back. I have to tell you how the golden boy was built, and how I was buried alive to make him shine. Growing up in our house meant living in two completely different realities. If you looked at the family photos lining the hallway, you'd see 4 smiling faces. But behind closed doors, a thick, invisible line split our home right down the middle. On one side was Julian. On the other side was me. I was 2 years older, but from the moment Julian could walk and talk, he was the center of gravity. My mother treated him like royalty. His bedroom was at the front of the house, facing the street. It was bright, huge, and painted a cheerful sky blue. The walls were lined with shelves displaying his Little League trophies, his perfectly arranged books, and framed certificates for participation. Everything about his space screamed success and potential. My room was at the back of the house, right next to the laundry room. It was dark, cramped, and usually smelled like detergent. But I didn't care. I loved my room because it was my sanctuary. While Julian was out on the manicured lawns of the country club learning to play golf, I was in my room with a soldering iron, breathing in the smell of hot metal and flux. I was obsessed with how things worked. I took apart old radios, broken televisions, and discarded computers I found in the neighborhood trash. I wanted to understand the logic behind the screens, the hidden language of the circuit boards. I remember one specific Tuesday afternoon. I was 14. I had spent 3 months mowing lawns and pulling weeds for the neighbors in the blazing summer heat. Every single dollar I earned went into a coffee can hidden under my bed. I was saving up for a specific high-end motherboard to build my first real computer. When I finally bought it, I felt like I was holding a brick of solid gold. I left it on my desk, carefully resting on its anti-static bag, while I went to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. When I came back to my room, the motherboard was gone. Panic seized my chest. I searched under the desk, in my closet, everywhere. Then I heard the heavy thud of the outside trash can lid slamming shut. I ran to the backyard. My mother was standing by the garbage bins, wiping her hands on a towel. "Mom, where is it?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Where's the green board that was on my desk?" She looked at me with an expression of pure irritation. "You mean that piece of garbage?" I threw it out. It was making a mess. Julian's golf coach is coming over for dinner tonight, and I am not having this house look like a junkyard. I lunged for the trash can, throwing the lid open. There it was, resting at the bottom, covered in coffee grounds and eggshells. One of the delicate capacitor pins was snapped clean off. It was ruined. 3 months of sweating in the sun, gone in an instant. "I bought that," I yelled, my hands shaking as I pulled the sticky, ruined board out of the trash. "I worked for that." My mother crossed her arms. She didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed that I was raising my voice. "Don't you take that tone with me, Caleb. You waste your time tinkering with trash instead of focusing on your future. Look at your brother. He's networking. He's building skills. You're going to end up fixing washing machines for a living if you don't change your attitude." She turned and walked back into the house, her heels clicking sharply on the patio stones. She didn't care about the money. She didn't care about the effort. To her, anything that wasn't Julian's world was just dirt to be swept away. I stood there alone in the backyard, holding the broken pieces of my hard work, wiping coffee grounds off the metal. I didn't cry. Crying was a weakness she would just use against me later. Instead, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. That was the day I realized that in this house, I would never be enough. I was just the dirt they walked on. By the time we hit high school, the gap between Julian and me had turned into an ocean. I kept my head down. I wore dark clothes, rode a beat-up bicycle, and spent my nights learning programming languages. I wasn't popular, but I didn't cause trouble. Julian, on the other hand, was the king of the school. He drove a brand new sedan my parents bought him for his 16th birthday. He threw parties. He had a different girlfriend every month. But Julian had a secret. He wasn't smart. He was just manipulative. He spent so much time maintaining his social image that he rarely opened a book. I found out how he was surviving academically during my senior year. I was sitting in the library, hidden behind a row of bookshelves, when I heard Julian's voice. He was talking to a kid named Thomas, the quiet valedictorian of our class. "Look, man," Julian was saying, his tone smooth and persuasive. I just need the answers for the AP Calc final. $50 now, 50 after the test. It's a victimless crime. Everyone wins. I peeked through the books. Thomas looked nervous, but he took the money. Julian was buying his grades. 2 weeks later, Julian got caught. The teacher noticed that Julian and Thomas had the exact same incorrect answer on a complex essay question. The principal called my parents in. It was a massive scandal, or at least it should have been. Cheating on an AP final was grounds for suspension, maybe even expulsion. It would ruin his chances of getting into a good college. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when my parents came home with Julian. Julian didn't look scared. He looked bored. My father, Robert, walked into the kitchen, his face flushed red. I expected him to scream. I expected him to ground Julian for a year. Instead, my father loosened his tie, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sighed. "We took care of it," my father said to my mother. I had a long talk with the principal. Made a very generous donation to the school's new athletic facility. They're going to let Julian retake a different version of the test. No permanent record. I dropped my pencil. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You paid them off?" I asked, staring at my father. "He cheated, and you bought his way out?" My father slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were cold, calculating. He wasn't the raging tyrant my mother was. He was the quiet mastermind. The man who pulled the strings in the shadows to keep the family image flawless. "You don't understand how the world works, Caleb," my father said, his voice dangerously low. "Family protects family. Julian made a mistake, but he is going to represent this family one day. He needs a clean record. You need to learn how to support your brother, instead of constantly trying to tear him down out of jealousy." Jealousy. They thought I was jealous of a fraud. But the real breaking point came 3 months later. It was pouring rain. Julian had taken my father's prized vintage Mustang out for a joyride without permission to impress a girl. He came back at 2 a.m., reeking of cheap beer, and slammed the front bumper right into the brick mailbox at the end of the driveway. A massive, ugly dent right in the chrome. Julian ran inside, panicked. He woke my father up. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching the whole thing unfold. My father looked at the car, then looked at Julian. Then, he looked up at me standing on the landing. "Caleb," my father said, pointing a finger at me. "Get down here." I walked down the stairs. My father pulled me into the garage, away from Julian. "Listen to me," my father whispered harshly, gripping my arm so tight it bruised. "Julian has college applications going out next week. A police report for reckless driving and underage drinking will destroy his future. I'm going to call the insurance company tomorrow. You are going to tell them you took the car to get late-night fast food because you were hungry. You hit a patch of wet leaves." "What?" I gasped, pulling my arm away. "No, I didn't do it. He did. He's drunk right now. I am not asking you, Caleb," my father hissed, his face inches from mine. "You don't have the grades he has. You don't have the future he has. You take this hit for the family. Do you understand me? Or I swear to God, I will stop paying for the groceries you eat and the electricity you use in that dark little room of yours." I stared at him. The man who was supposed to protect me was using me as a human shield for his golden boy. I realized then that my father wasn't a peacekeeper. He was a manipulator. He knew exactly what Julian was, but he hid it to protect his own ego, his own reflection in society. I took the blame. I paid the deductible out of my own savings. And the day after I graduated high school, I packed a single duffel bag and walked out the door. I left at 18. I didn't say goodbye. I just left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'm out." I knew they wouldn't come looking for me. They probably threw a party when they realized they had the house all to themselves with their perfect son. I rented a tiny, miserable apartment on the bad side of town. The ceiling leaked, and the radiator clanked all night, but it was mine. To survive, I got a job as a mechanic at a dusty garage off the highway. I spent my days covered in motor oil, fixing brake pads and changing transmissions. My hands were permanently stained black. But my nights? My nights belonged to the code. I would come home, eat a bowl of cheap instant ramen, and open my battered, second-hand laptop. I taught myself advanced cybersecurity. I learned how to build firewalls, how to spot vulnerabilities in networks, how to build impenetrable digital fortresses. I was hungry, not just for food, but for success. I wanted to build something so big, so undeniable, that no one could ever throw it in the trash again. That's when I met Elijah. Elijah was a brilliant, eccentric guy who worked the night shift at a local server farm. We met on an obscure online coding forum, arguing over the best way to encrypt data streams. We decided to meet up for coffee, and within an hour we realized we had the exact same vision. He had the hardware connections, I had the software architecture. We can build a better mousetrap, Elijah told me, his eyes wide with excitement behind his thick glasses. Corporate security is a joke right now. We build a dynamic encryption protocol, we can sell it to the highest bidder. We became brothers. The kind of brother Julian never was. We pooled our meager savings, quit our day jobs, and moved our operation into a cheap, windowless warehouse space. We lived on coffee, pizza crusts, and pure adrenaline. There were months where I couldn't afford electricity in my own apartment, so I slept on a sleeping bag under my desk at the warehouse. We worked 20 hours a day. We failed 100 times. The code crashed. The servers overheated. We screamed at each other, we threw things, and then we sat back down and fixed it. I never told my family a word about this. To them, I was exactly what they predicted. A high school dropout working as a grease monkey. Whenever my mother bothered to call, usually once every 6 months, just to satisfy her own conscience, she would sigh loudly into the phone. Still working with cars, Caleb? She would say. Julian just pledged the best fraternity on campus. We are so proud of him. He's going places. That's great, Mom, I would reply, my voice completely flat, staring at a screen filled with thousands of lines of complex code that was about to change the industry. I gotta go. Have a shift. I let them believe I was a failure. It was easier that way. They couldn't ruin what they didn't know existed. Then, 2 years later, it happened. Our protocol worked. We managed to secure a meeting with a mid-sized financial firm that had recently suffered a massive data breach. We set up our software on their internal servers. We told their best hackers to try and break in. They spent 3 days trying. They couldn't even make a scratch on the surface. The CEO of the firm walked into the conference room, looked at Elijah and me, 2 guys in our early 20s wearing jeans and hoodies, and slid a contract across the table. It was our first major deal. The check was for an amount of money I had never seen in my entire life. I remember walking out of that glass office building, the sun hitting my face, and realizing I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was winning. Over the next 4 years, Elijah and I built our startup into a formidable force in the cybersecurity world. We hired a team. We moved into a real office. We secured multi-million-dollar contracts with major corporations. I bought myself a nice apartment. I bought a reliable truck. I didn't buy flashy clothes or sports cars. I kept my head down and kept building the empire in the shadows. I was a self-made millionaire before I turned 25. And my family still thought I was changing oil filters for minimum wage. While I was building a real company, Julian was busy building a fantasy. Through the grapevine and occasional glimpses at his public social media profiles, I kept track of the golden boy. Julian had graduated college. Barely, I assumed, and immediately declared himself an entrepreneur. His Instagram was a masterclass in faking it till you make it. He posted pictures of himself in tailored suits, leaning against expensive cars he definitely didn't own, using hashtags like #grindset, #Ciolif, and #generational wealth. He claimed he was running a high-end financial consulting firm. It was all smoke and mirrors. I knew it, but my parents bought it hook, line, and sinker. They bragged about him to anyone who would listen. They funded his lifestyle, paying his rent in a luxury downtown apartment so he could keep up appearances for his imaginary clients. One evening, I was sitting in my office, going over some complex server logs, when my cell phone rang. The caller ID said, Mom. I stared at it for a long moment. She hadn't called me in 8 months. I hit accept. Hello? Caleb. It's your mother. Her voice was tight, strained, lacking any of the usual fake warmth she used in public. Hey, Mom. Is everything okay? She sighed. A heavy, dramatic sound. Well, not exactly. We have a bit of a cash flow issue right now. Your father's investments are tied up and Julian has an incredible opportunity. A massive project. He just needs a little bridge capital to close the deal. It's a sure thing. I leaned back in my leather chair, rubbing my eyes. Bridge capital? You mean a loan? Don't use that tone, she snapped quickly. He's doing big things, Caleb. Things you wouldn't understand. We need $5,000 by tomorrow morning. Your father and I will pay you back next month. I know you don't make much at the garage, but surely you have some savings stashed away somewhere. You don't have a family to support, you don't have a mortgage. I almost laughed. I had $5,000 sitting in my checking account just for casual expenses. But it was the principle. She was calling the son she despised, the son she threw away, to beg for money to fund the son she worshipped. I'm not giving you $5,000 for Julian's imaginary business. Mom, I said calmly. The silence on the line was deafening. Then, the explosion. Excuse me? She hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Your own brother is on the verge of a massive breakthrough, and you won't help him? After everything we did for you? We put a roof over your head. We fed you. You threw me to the wolves every chance you got. I replied, my voice never rising above a steady hum. Julian is a fraud. He's draining you dry, and you're too blind to see it. If his business is so successful, why does he need $5,000 from a grease monkey? You are a selfish, bitter, useless boy. She screamed into the phone. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of him. He is going to be a millionaire, Caleb, and you are going to die alone with grease under your fingernails. Don't you ever call this house again. She slammed the phone down. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. I didn't feel angry. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. She had drawn the line in the sand permanently. I looked around my massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I looked at the framed $1 Elijah and I had ever made hanging on the wall. Okay, Mom, I whispered to the empty room. Let's see who ends up with the grease. I thought that was the end of it. I thought I could just live my life and leave them to their delusions. But I underestimated the depth of their toxic dependency on Julian. And I underestimated how far they would go to protect his lies. The storm was coming, and it was going to hit me where I was most vulnerable. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about to become personal. Very, very personal. 6 months after that phone call, the family summoned me again. It was my mother's 60th birthday. Usually, I would have ignored the invitation, but my Aunt Clara had called me privately and begged me to come. She's getting older, Caleb, Clara had pleaded. Just make an appearance. For peace. I had recently gotten engaged to Chloe. Chloe was a brilliant, grounded woman who saw me for exactly who I was. She knew the whole history with my family. When I told her about the invitation, she held my hand and said, "We go together. You don't have to face them alone." I decided I was going to try. One last time. I wanted to show them I was doing okay, even if I couldn't reveal the whole truth about the company yet. I went to a high-end jeweler and bought a beautiful vintage pearl necklace for my mother. Cost me $3,000. It was elegant, timeless, and completely authentic. The party was at a fancy steakhouse downtown. When Chloe and I walked into the private dining room, the temperature seemed to drop. I was wearing a clean, dark button-down shirt and nice jeans. I looked presentable, but next to Julian, who was wearing a flashy velvet blazer, I looked like the hired help. "Caleb," my father said, giving me a stiff nod. He barely looked at Chloe when I introduced her. We sat at the far end of the long table. When it was time for gifts, my mother sat at the head of the table like a queen receiving tribute. I handed her my small velvet box first. She opened it, looked at the pearls, and her face remained completely blank. "Oh," she said, her tone flat. "Pearls. How traditional. Must have set you back a whole week's pay at the garage." "Thank you, Caleb." She snapped the box shut and shoved it to the side without even taking the necklace out. I felt Chloe's hand squeeze my knee under the table. I kept my mouth shut. Then Julian stood up. He produced a massive, gaudy shopping bag with a huge designer logo printed on it. He pulled out a bright red leather handbag with a giant, gold-plated buckle. It was loud, flashy, and completely tasteless. "For the best mother in the world," Julian announced smoothly. "From my first major consulting bonus." My mother gasped, clasping her hands over her mouth. "Julian, oh my goodness, this is a limited edition. This must have cost a fortune." She stood up and hugged him tightly, tears welling in her eyes. "You shouldn't have, but I love it. I absolutely love it. Look, everyone, look what my son bought me." She paraded the bag around the table. As she walked past me, I caught a glimpse of the stitching on the handle. It was uneven. The gold plating on the buckle was slightly chipped at the edge. It was a fake, a cheap knockoff. I knew it and Julian knew it, but my mother was blind with pride. Nathan, Julian's best friend since high school, was sitting across from me. He leaned over, a smug smirk on his face. He was wearing a suit too tight for his shoulders. "So, Caleb," Nathan said loudly, making sure the whole table could hear. "Still rotating tires for a living? Must be tough watching Julian close deals while you're scrubbing grease off your hands." The table went quiet. Everyone looked at me, waiting for my reaction. My mother looked at me with a warning glare, daring me to ruin her perfect moment. I looked at Nathan, then at Julian, who was sipping his champagne, looking incredibly pleased with himself. I thought about the $50 million buyout offer my company had just received from a major tech conglomerate. I thought about the pearls sitting in the closed box. "It's an honest living, Nathan," I said evenly, staring right into his eyes until his smirk faltered a little. "I sleep fine at night knowing exactly how I earned my money." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like that answer. But before he could say anything, my father stood up and demanded a toast. The tension broke, but the message was clear. I had walked right back into the trap. I was the designated loser in their narrative, and they were going to make sure I stayed in my place. But the real devastation, the knife in the back, wasn't going to come from a fake designer bag. It was going to come from the grave. A month after the birthday disaster, my grandfather passed away. He was my father's dad, a tough, silent man who lived up in the mountains. He was the only person in that family who ever treated me with a shred of respect. While my parents were busy grooming Julian, my grandfather would take me fishing. He taught me how to whittle wood, how to fix a broken carburetor on his old truck, how to be quiet and listen to the world. He owned a small, rustic cabin on a plot of land near a lake. It wasn't worth millions, but it was beautiful. It was the only place I ever felt truly safe as a kid. When he got sick, I was the one who drove up every weekend to chop wood for him and fix his leaky roof. Julian never visited. He said the cabin smelled like old people and dirt. After the funeral, the immediate family gathered in the dark, stuffy office of the family lawyer, Mr. David. My parents, Julian, Uncle Matthew, and I sat in heavy leather chairs. Uncle Matthew was my father's younger brother. He had always played the role of the jovial, fair-minded uncle. When my parents were screaming at me, Uncle Matthew would sometimes slip me a $20 bill and tell me to hang in there, kid. I trusted him. Mr. David cleared his throat and opened the thick manila folder containing the will. He read through the standard legal jargon, dividing the modest cash assets between my father and Uncle Matthew. And then he got to the property. Regarding the property located at Lakeview Ridge, commonly known as the cabin, the lawyer read, adjusting his glasses. "I leave this property in its entirety to my grandson, Caleb. He is the only one who knows how to take care of it, and the only one who appreciates the quiet." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A lump formed in my throat. He remembered. He saw me. "What? My mother gasped, sitting up straight. That's impossible. That land has been in the family for decades. It should go to Robert and then to Julian. The will is quite clear, Evelyn, the lawyer said calmly. My father's face turned purple. He looked at Uncle Matthew. And that's when the real betrayal happened. Uncle Matthew didn't look at me. He stared down at his hands, his jovial face replaced by a hard, calculating mask. He cleared his throat. Actually, David, Uncle Matthew said smoothly, I believe we need to contest that specific clause. Dad wasn't in his right mind during his final months. He was suffering from dementia. We all know that. I froze. What are you talking about? I demanded, my voice rising. He was perfectly lucid. I talked to him 3 days before he died. We discussed replacing the water pump on the truck. Caleb, please, my father snapped, waving his hand dismissively. You're not a doctor. Dad was confused. He clearly meant for the property to stay within the primary lineage. Matthew and I are in agreement. I stared at Uncle Matthew, the man who used to slip me money, the man who told me he had my back. I saw it in his eyes then. Greed. The land the cabin sat on had recently been zoned for commercial development. A massive resort company was buying up lots around the lake. The cabin itself was worthless, but the land under it was suddenly worth a small fortune. You're lying, I said, my voice trembling with rage. You both know you're lying. He left it to me. It's a matter of inheritance protocol, Julian chimed in, sounding like a lawyer himself, though he had no idea what he was talking about. It's best for the family portfolio if the asset is managed centrally, by Dad, and eventually me. I looked at the lawyer. Mr. David looked uncomfortable, shuffling his papers. If the two sons contest the mental competence of the deceased at the time of the signing, it will go to probate. It will be tied up in court for years, Caleb, unless you have the funds to fight a protracted legal battle against your father and uncle. They knew I didn't have the money, or at least they thought I didn't have the money. They thought I was a broke mechanic. They were banking on crushing me legally because they assumed I couldn't afford a lawyer. They were stealing my grandfather's final gift to me, right in front of my face, and dressing it up as protecting the family. You disgust me, I said, standing up. I looked at Uncle Matthew one last time. He finally met my eyes, and he didn't look sorry at all. He just looked greedy. All of you. I walked out of the lawyer's office. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails dug into my palms. The betrayal burned like acid in my veins. But it wasn't over. They didn't just want to steal the cabin. They wanted me to hand it over willingly, to humiliate me completely. 2 weeks later, the hammer fell. I was at my apartment, trying to figure out how to handle the probate situation without revealing my true financial status, when my phone rang. It was my father. He demanded I come to their house immediately. Family emergency, he said, his voice clipped and urgent. When I arrived, the atmosphere in the living room was thick with tension. My mother was pacing nervously. Julian was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, looking completely disheveled. The tailored suits were gone. He was wearing sweatpants and looking pale. My father stood by the fireplace, holding a stack of legal documents. Sit down, my father ordered as soon as I walked in. I didn't sit. What's going on? My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Julian has run into a slight cash flow problem with his firm. A temporary setback. But the creditors are being aggressive. Very aggressive. Julian looked up, his eyes red. They're threatening to file criminal charges, Caleb, for fraud. It was a misunderstanding with the client funds. But they won't listen. If I don't give them $300,000 by Friday, I'm going to jail. I stared at him. The golden boy. The fake CEO. The facade was finally cracking. So, I said coldly, what does that have to do with me? Go sell your fake Gucci bags. Don't you dare speak to him like that. My mother shrieked, rushing over to Julian and putting her arms around him defensively. Your brother is in trouble. Here is the solution, my father said, stepping forward and dropping the papers on the coffee table. The development company made an aggressive cash offer for the lake property yesterday, for $100,000. It's enough to pay off Julian's debt and keep him out of prison. I looked at the papers. The property is in probate because you contested the will. We will drop the contestation immediately, my father said smoothly. The property becomes yours legally today, and you will immediately sign this quitclaim deed, transferring the title to Julian so he can finalize the sale to the developers. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless. They wanted me to give up my grandfather's legacy to pay off Julian's criminal debts. No, I said instantly. Absolutely not. He made his mess. He can clean it up. Caleb, please. My mother cried, actual tears streaming down her face now. He's your brother. He's blood. If he goes to prison, his life is over. The family name is ruined. You have to do this. I don't have to do anything. I fired back, my anger finally boiling over. You spent my entire life treating me like garbage. You threw away my things, you made me take the blame for his drunk driving, you stole my inheritance, and now you want me to bail out this pathetic fraud? He lied to you. He's not a CEO. He's a criminal. Shut your mouth. My father roared. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides. Before I could react, he swung his arm. The back of his hand connected hard across my jaw. The crack echoed in the silent room. My head snapped to the side. I tasted copper in my mouth. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional shock was staggering. He had never hit me before. Not like that. I slowly turned my head back to look at him. My father was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his face contorted with rage. You are nothing, my father spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. You hear me? You are nothing compared to him. You will never be a fraction of the man your brother is. You are a selfish, spiteful little mechanic. You sign those papers right now or you are dead to me. You are no longer my son. I stood there, feeling the sting on my cheek. I looked at my mother, who was watching with cold approval. I looked at Julian, who was hiding behind her like a coward, waiting for me to save him. The last fragile thread connecting me to this family snapped. The desire for their approval, the desperate childhood hope that they would one day love me, evaporated completely. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying emptiness. You're right, I said quietly, wiping a drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I am not your son. I turned around and walked to the front door. Caleb, my mother screamed. If you walk out that door, don't you ever come back. We will cut you out completely. I didn't stop. I opened the door, stepped out into the cold night air, and slammed it shut behind me. That was the bottom, the absolute rock bottom. I was entirely alone. But as I walked to my truck, my hands stopped shaking. The fear was gone. If I wasn't their son anymore, then I didn't have to play by their rules. It was time to find out exactly what kind of monster Julian really was. I drove straight to the warehouse. It was 1 a.m., but Elijah was there, surrounded by empty energy drink cans, his face illuminated by the blue glow of 4 massive monitors. I walked in, grabbed a chair, and pulled it up next to him. Elijah, I need a favor, a big one. He took one look at the bruising on my jaw and his fingers stopped typing. Who do I need to destroy? My brother, I said, my voice dead serious. Julian, I want to know everything. Every digital footprint, every financial record, every dirty little secret he's hiding behind that fake CEO title. I want him dismantled. Elijah cracked his knuckles. Give me his full name, his phone number, and any email addresses you know. For the next 6 hours, we didn't speak. I watched as Elijah navigated through the dark corners of the web, bypassing firewalls and pulling public records, credit histories, and digital breadcrumbs that Julian thought he had buried. As the files started downloading into a secure folder on our server, the true, horrifying picture of my brother's life came into focus. It was worse than I thought. Much worse. First, we found his college records. Julian didn't graduate. He was expelled in his junior year for academic fraud. He had been caught running a ring paying people to write term papers for wealthy students. He never got a degree. Look at this, Elijah said, tapping his screen. He doesn't own a consulting firm. The LLC he registered is just a shell company. It has zero revenue. He uses it to apply for corporate credit cards. We dug deeper into the finances. Julian was swimming in debt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest loans, maxed-out credit cards, and outstanding tabs at luxury car rental agencies. He was literally renting the sports cars he posed with on Instagram by the hour. But then, Elijah opened a file that made my blood run cold. It was a property record. "Caleb," Elijah said quietly, his voice losing all its usual sarcastic edge. "Look at this mortgage document." I leaned in. It was a second mortgage taken out on my parents' house. For $400,000. The exact amount of Julian's debt. I read the signatures. My father's signature was there. My mother's signature was there. But the notary stamp looked strange. "Run a check on that notary," I told Elijah. 2 minutes later, we had the answer. The notary was a fake. Julian had forged my parents' signatures to take out a massive loan against their house, the house they had lived in for 30 years. He stole the equity they had built over a lifetime to fund his fake millionaire lifestyle. And when the payments came due and the bank threatened to foreclose, he panicked. That's why they needed the cabin. They weren't just saving Julian from criminal charges. They were trying to save their own home, probably without even realizing Julian was the one who put it in jeopardy in the first place. Or maybe my father did know. Maybe he knew Julian forged the signatures and was still trying to cover it up by stealing my inheritance. "He's a parasite," Elijah whispered, staring at the screen. "He's literally eating your family alive." "And they let him," I replied, feeling a sickening mixture of disgust and pity. But we found one more thing. A series of recurring payments from Julian's personal checking account. Small amounts, $500 here, $800 there, sent to a woman named Sarah. Sarah was his current girlfriend, the one he brought to the family dinners, the quiet girl who always looked a little nervous. Elijah hacked into the metadata of some photos Julian had sent. We found text messages. Sarah was pregnant, and Julian was violently pressuring her to get an abortion because a baby would ruin his aesthetic, and he needed to keep up appearances to secure funding from a wealthy investor whose daughter he was secretly sleeping with on the side. I pushed back from the desk, feeling like I was going to throw up. The level of sociopathy was staggering. He wasn't just a fraud, he was a monster. He was destroying my parents, he was destroying this girl, and he had tried to destroy me to cover his tracks. I looked at the folder on the screen, labeled Julian_full_profile. It was a nuclear bomb. All I had to do was press the button. The next afternoon, the sky broke open. A massive thunderstorm rolled in, dumping sheets of freezing rain. I didn't care. I drove my truck up the winding mountain road, the tires slipping in the mud, until I reached Lakeview Ridge. Chloe was sitting in the passenger seat. She had insisted on coming. She held my hand tight as we pulled up to the cabin. The place looked miserable in the rain. The roof was sagging, the paint was peeling, and the old wooden porch looked ready to collapse. But the worst part was the bright, neon orange paper stapled to the front door. Notice of foreclosure. Property seized by county authorities for non-payment of taxes. I killed the engine and just stared through the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. Uncle Matthew and my father had tied the property up in probate, freezing the assets. Without me to pay the property taxes, which I used to do quietly every year, the county had moved in. By contesting the will, they hadn't just stolen it from me. They had lost it entirely. The developers would buy it at auction for pennies on the dollar. Grandpa's sanctuary was gone. I opened the door and stepped out into the freezing rain. I walked up to the porch, my boots sinking into the mud, and stood in front of that orange paper. The cold water ran down my neck, soaking my shirt. I placed my hand flat against the rough wood of the door. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, rough and quiet, telling me how to sand down the edges of a birdhouse. I had spent my whole life trying to be the bigger person. I took the high road. I walked away. I built my own life in silence so I wouldn't disrupt their perfect narrative. And this is what the high road got me. My grandfather's memory desecrated, a bruised jaw, and a family that would gladly watch me drown if it meant keeping Julian dry. I felt a warm presence beside me. Chloe had stepped out of the truck and walked up onto the porch. She didn't have an umbrella. Her hair was instantly plastered to her face. She wrapped her arms around my waist and rested her head against my back. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she whispered over the sound of the rain. "I'm so sorry. They destroyed it," I said, my voice raspy. "Just like they destroy everything they touch." "You can let it go," Chloe said gently. "We have our own life. You don't need them. You don't need this place. We can build our own." I turned around and looked at her. She was beautiful, even shivering in the rain. She was my real family. She was right. I didn't need the cabin. I had millions of dollars in the bank. I could buy 100 cabins. But it wasn't about the cabin anymore. It was about justice. It was about stopping a parasite before he consumed everything. If I walked away now, Julian would keep lying, keep destroying lives, and my parents would keep enabling him until they were living on the street. I looked back at the orange notice. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. The rock bottom had given me a solid foundation to stand on. "No," I said, my voice suddenly clear and steady. "I'm not letting it go. Not this time." I took Chloe's hand and led her back to the truck. We got inside, the heater blasting, shivering against the cold leather seats. "What are you going to do?" Chloe asked, looking at my face. She knew that look. It was the same look I had when Elijah and I were cracking a seemingly impossible code. "I'm going to give them exactly what they want," I said, putting the truck in gear. "I'm going to give them a family gathering, a celebration of Julian's brilliant future. I'm going to set a stage so bright, they won't be able to hide the shadows anymore." I pulled out my phone and dialed Elijah's number. He answered on the first ring. "Elijah," I said, "that buyout offer from Mr. Carter. Is it still on the table?" "Yeah," Elijah said, sounding surprised. "He called yesterday asking if we'd reconsidered." "Why?" "I thought you wanted to stay independent for another year." "Tell him we're ready to sell," I said, staring straight ahead at the muddy road. 50 million. But I have one non-negotiable condition for signing the contract. And he has to agree to it today. Mr. Carter was not a man who was used to being given conditions. He was a Silicon Valley titan, a billionaire who made his fortune by ruthlessly acquiring tech startups and integrating them into his massive conglomerate. He drove a custom black Porsche 911, wore bespoke suits that looked like armor, and had a gaze that could cut glass. Elijah and I met him in the private VIP lounge of a high-end steakhouse downtown. Carter sat across from us, swirling a glass of scotch, looking mildly amused. "So," Carter said, his deep voice rumbling, 50 million. It's a fair valuation for your encryption protocol. My team has stress-tested your software, Caleb. It's brilliant. Annoyingly brilliant. You've built a fortress." "Thank you, Mr. Carter," I said smoothly. I wasn't wearing my leather jacket today. I wore a sharp, tailored suit. I needed him to see me as an equal, not just a desperate kid with good code. "But Elijah tells me there is a unique contingency attached to this deal," Carter said, raising an eyebrow. "I don't usually do contingencies. I write a check, you sign the IP over. Simple." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "The tech is yours, Mr. Carter. The team transitions smoothly, but the signing of the actual contract has to happen on my terms. Specifically, the location and the timing." Carter took a sip of his scotch. "I'm listening." "It has to happen on Thanksgiving Day," I said, "at exactly 6 p.m. And it has to happen at my parents' house in the suburbs. You have to bring the physical contract there in person and hand it to me." Carter stopped swirling his glass. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he tried to calculate the angle. "Thanksgiving? In the suburbs? Caleb, I have a holiday gala in Aspen. You want me to play delivery boy at a family dinner? I know it's unconventional," I said, holding his gaze. "But I've done my research on you, Mr. Carter. You built your empire from nothing. You know what it's like to be underestimated by people who think pedigree matters more than results. A flicker of recognition crossed Carter's face. He knew exactly what I was talking about. I am selling you my life's work, I continued. This company is my blood and sweat. The only thing I want in return, besides the 50 million, is the right to close this chapter of my life exactly how I see fit. And I need to do it in that specific room, in front of those specific people. Carter set his glass down. He looked at Elijah, who gave a slight, affirming nod. Carter leaned back, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He recognized a power play when he saw one. He recognized a man who was about to settle a massive score. You want an audience, Carter observed astutely. I want a reckoning, I corrected him. Carter let out a short, sharp laugh. I like you, Caleb. You're ruthless. I appreciate a man who knows how to execute a theatrical victory. Fine. You have your condition. Thanksgiving. 6 p.m. But if you waste my time, the deal is off, and I will personally ensure your software is obsolete within a year. You won't be wasting your time, I promised him. We shook hands. The trap was set. Now, I just needed to make sure the rats walked into it. The hardest part of the plan wasn't negotiating a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. The hardest part was making the phone call to my father. I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone for 20 minutes before I finally pressed call. I had to play the part perfectly. I had to swallow every ounce of my pride and sound exactly like the broken, defeated son they wanted me to be. He answered on the third ring. What do you want, Caleb? His voice was cold, defensive. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to shake slightly. Dad, I'm calling to apologize. Silence on the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. I was out of line, I continued, staring at the ceiling. I was angry about Grandpa's cabin, but I shouldn't have said those things. You were right. Family is important. And I don't want to be cut out completely. I know I've been a disappointment. It made me sick to say the words, but the hook caught. Well, my father said, his tone instantly shifting from defensive to patronizingly triumphant. I appreciate you finally coming to your senses, Caleb. Takes a big man to admit when he's failed. Your mother has been very upset. I know. That's why I'm calling. Is there any way? Could Chloe and I still come to Thanksgiving dinner? I just want to make peace. I'll sit in the back. I won't cause any trouble. He let out a heavy sigh, playing the merciful king. I will have to discuss it with Evelyn. And Julian, you owe your brother a massive apology for your jealousy. But, yes, you can come. Be here at 4 p.m. Don't embarrass us. Thank you, Dad, I said quietly, and hung up. I threw the phone onto the couch and let out a harsh laugh. They were so predictable. Their egos were so massive they couldn't conceive of a reality where I wasn't crawling back to them. The next few weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I kept tabs on Julian through Sarah's social media. Julian was ramping up his lies for the grand finale. He had somehow caught wind that Mr. Carter's conglomerate was expanding. So, naturally, Julian spun a web of lies, telling my parents that he was being aggressively recruited by Carter himself for a VP position. My mother called me 2 days before Thanksgiving. She couldn't resist gloating. Caleb, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I just wanted to make sure you were still coming. Julian has some very big news to share at dinner. He's been headhunted by one of the biggest tech billionaires in the world. The salary is astronomical. He'll be securing the family's legacy. Wow, Mom, I said deadpan. That's incredible. Carter, right? Yes, Mr. Carter. Julian had a private lunch with him last week. She lied effortlessly, repeating whatever garbage Julian had fed her. I just wanted to warn you so you don't feel too inadequate when he makes the announcement. We just want a peaceful holiday. Don't worry, Mom, I said, looking at the finalized $50 million contract sitting on my desk, waiting for Carter's signature. I won't feel inadequate at all. I can't wait to hear Julian's announcement. I hung up the phone and looked at the clock. The countdown had begun. They had spent my entire life trying to bury me. They had stolen my inheritance, they had hit me, they had called me nothing. They thought they had won. But they didn't realize they had just invited the architect of their destruction into their living room. The storm wasn't just coming anymore. The storm was here. I was standing right back where we started. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the rich smell of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and expensive wine. This was my mother's stage. She had spent 3 days preparing for this exact moment, setting the table with her finest china, making sure every fork was perfectly aligned. The extended family was packed around the long oak table. Uncle Matthew was there, looking as jovial as ever, completely ignoring the fact that he had helped steal my inheritance just weeks prior. My father sat at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, radiating authority. And then there was Julian. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit. He sat right next to my father, swirling a glass of Cabernet, acting like he owned the world. His girlfriend, Sarah, sat quietly beside him, looking pale and keeping her eyes fixed on her plate. I stood leaning against the archway, my worn leather jacket feeling like a shield. Chloe stood right next to me. She squeezed my hand. Her touch was the only thing keeping me grounded in reality. My mother tapped her spoon against her crystal water glass. The sharp, clinking sound cut through the loud chatter. The room went completely silent. Everyone turned their heads toward her. She stood up slowly, smoothing down her immaculate dress. She looked around the table, her eyes shining with absolute adoration when they landed on Julian. "Family," she started, her voice trembling just the right amount. "We have so much to be thankful for this year, but most of all we are thankful for Julian, our golden boy." Julian looked down modestly. It made my stomach turn. Julian has just informed us that he is in the final stages of securing an executive position at one of the biggest tech firms in Silicon Valley. A future CEO. He has worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and now the world is finally recognizing his brilliance. Aunt Clara wiped a tear from her eye. Uncle Matthew raised his glass. The whole room erupted in applause. Julian offered a tight, patronizing little smile and nodded to the crowd. Then the clapping died down. My mother's eyes slowly drifted across the room. They passed over my aunts and cousins, finally landing on me. The warmth vanished from her face instantly. Her lips thinned into a hard, white line. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my boots and my jacket. And to Caleb, she said, her tone dropping 10 degrees. "Well, we are thankful you decided to show up. Maybe one day you'll learn to dress like a respectable adult, instead of a mechanic who just crawled out from under a truck. But we love you anyway." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Nathan, Julian's obnoxious best friend, smirked at me from across the table. "I mean, somebody has to change the oil in Julian's new company car, right?" Nathan joked loudly. More laughter. Julian shook his head playfully. "Leave him alone, Nathan. Caleb does the best he can with what he has." I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I just smiled back at my mother. A slow, calm smile that I knew she couldn't understand. My jaw clenched tight. I shoved my hands deeper into my jacket pockets, my fingers brushing against my phone. Julian cleared his throat and stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, preparing to deliver his grand lie. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, everyone. It's true. I had a private lunch with Mr. Carter yesterday. He's a brilliant man, a billionaire, and he practically begged me to come on board as his vice president of acquisitions. It's a massive salary, stock options, the whole package. I'm going to make sure this family is taken care of for generations." My father beamed. "That's my boy. A true leader." I checked my watch. 5:59 p.m. "That's a beautiful story, Julian," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. Julian looked at me, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Excuse me?" I said. "It's a beautiful story. The private lunch, the VP position, the stock options. Sounds like a movie." I took a step forward, leaving the archway and entering the dining room. But there's just one problem. My mother slammed her hand down on the table. Caleb, do not ruin this night. I warned you. I ignored her. I kept my eyes locked on Julian. Mr. Carter hates lunch meetings. He says they're a waste of time. He prefers to do his business in boardrooms. Or, occasionally, at 6 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. Julian frowned. What are you talking about? Before anyone could say another word, a low, aggressive rumble shook the front windows. A pair of bright LED headlights swept across the dining room curtains. The deep, unmistakable growl of a twin-turbo engine settled in the driveway. Everyone at the table froze. My mother looked toward the front door, her eyes wide. Who on earth is that? The doorbell rang. A sharp, heavy buzz. My mother scrambled out of her chair, smoothing her dress frantically. Julian, did you invite someone from the firm? Is it one of your new colleagues? Julian looked confused, but he quickly plastered his fake smile back on. It might be. I have a lot of high-profile contacts. My mother practically ran to the foyer. She threw open the heavy oak door. Standing on the porch was Mr. Carter. He looked like he had just stepped out of a financial magazine. He wore a sharp, custom-made black overcoat over a dark suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed. He radiated an aura of pure, intimidating wealth and power. Two large men in dark suits stood behind him on the porch, his security detail. My mother gasped, putting her hands to her cheeks. She recognized his face immediately from the business news segments she watched obsessively. Mr. Carter, she breathed, practically bowing. Oh my goodness, what an absolute honor. Please come in. Come in. Julian didn't tell us you were dropping by. Carter stepped into the foyer. He didn't smile. He didn't take off his coat. His cold, calculating eyes swept over my mother, dismissing her instantly. He walked past her into the dining room. Julian leaped out of his chair, extending his hand, his face glowing with triumph. He thought Carter was actually there for him. He thought his lies had miraculously turned into reality. Mr. Carter, Julian beamed loudly. Welcome to our home. I was just telling my family about our incredible lunch. Carter stopped. He looked at Julian's extended hand. He didn't take it. He just stared at Julian like he was looking at a stain on the carpet. Who are you? Carter asked, his deep voice carrying clearly across the dead-silent room. Julian's hand dropped. The color completely drained from his face. I'm Julian. We met. Carter didn't let him finish. He completely ignored Julian and turned his gaze toward the archway. His eyes locked onto me. The intimidating scowl vanished, replaced by a look of deep professional respect. Carter walked right past Julian, right past my father, and stopped directly in front of me. Director Caleb, Carter said, extending his hand. I took my hands out of my leather jacket and shook it firmly. Mr. Carter, thank you for making the drive. Carter reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He handed it to me, the $50 million acquisition contract. Signed by my board. I brought the cashier's check for the first installment as well. Your encryption protocol is officially ours. Congratulations. Someone at the table dropped a wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. My mother stumbled into the dining room, grabbing the back of a chair for support. Wait, what is happening? Caleb, why is Mr. Carter calling you a director? Why is he giving you a contract? I looked at my mother. Then I looked at Julian. He looked like he was about to faint. Julian didn't have lunch with Mr. Carter, I said, my voice steady and cold. Julian has never met Mr. Carter. My company, the cybersecurity firm I built from nothing with my partner over the last 6 years, just sold our proprietary software to Mr. Carter's conglomerate for $50 million. My father's jaw was practically on the floor. 50 million? You're a mechanic. I was a mechanic, I corrected him. Then I became a software engineer. Then I became a CEO. All while you thought I was scraping grease off the floor. Carter looked at Julian with an expression of pure disgust. I had my HR department run a check on this man after you mentioned his name, Caleb. He applied for a junior sales position at one of our subsidiary branches last month. His resume was entirely fabricated. We flagged him for fraud and rejected his application in the first round. Julian stumbled back, hitting the edge of the dining table. No, that's a mistake. I'm a consultant. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a manila envelope, the one Elijah had compiled. I tossed it onto the center of the dining table. It landed right next to the roasted turkey. You're not a consultant, Julian, I said. You're a con artist. And a really bad one. I looked at my father. He was staring at the envelope like it was a live grenade. Open it, Dad, I commanded. I had never spoken to him with that kind of authority before. He actually flinched. His shaking hands reached out and pulled the documents from the envelope. What is this? My father muttered, his eyes scanning the pages. That is Julian's real life, I told the room. He didn't graduate college. He was expelled for academic fraud. He doesn't own a business. He has $300,000 in maxed-out credit card debt and high-interest loans. My mother shook her head frantically. No, Caleb, you're lying. You forged this because you're jealous. Robert, don't look at that garbage. My father wasn't listening to her. His eyes were wide with horror. He flipped to the third page. His face turned an ashen gray. He looked up at Julian, his breathing suddenly ragged. Julian, my father choked out. What is this? It's fake, Dad, Julian stammered, sweating profusely. Caleb hates me. He faked it all. Turn to the fourth page, I said to my father. My father turned the page. He stared at it for a long, terrible moment. The paper started shaking in his hands. It's a second mortgage, I said, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the room. Taken out 6 months ago against this house. For $400,000. The exact amount of debt Julian needed to clear. My mother froze. A mortgage? Robert, what is he talking about? We own this house outright. My father looked at my mother, then slowly turned his gaze back to Julian. The signatures. Evelyn's signature. My signature. Julian. You forged our signatures. Julian backed away, his hands raised defensively. Dad, listen. I had an investment opportunity. It was a sure thing. I just needed liquid capital. I was going to pay it back before you ever noticed. But the market shifted, and the creditors. You stole our house? My mother shrieked. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire reality shatter into pieces. You put our home in foreclosure. That's why you wanted the cabin, I said, looking at my father and Uncle Matthew. You contested Grandpa's will so you could steal my inheritance to pay off the bank, so you wouldn't lose your own house to your golden boy's criminal fraud. Uncle Matthew looked down at his plate. He didn't say a word. He knew he was caught. My father stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He lunged toward Julian, grabbing him by the lapels of his expensive suit. I gave you everything. I paid for everything. And you forged my name. Dad, stop. Please. Julian cried, trying to pry my father's hands off his jacket. It was Sarah's fault. She drains my money. She demands expensive things. I had to keep up appearances for her. That was the wrong thing to say. Sarah, who had been sitting frozen in her chair the entire time, suddenly stood up. Her chair tipped over backward and crashed onto the floor. Julian looked at her, his eyes wide with panic. Sarah, tell them how much you spend. Sarah didn't look scared anymore. She looked furious. She walked around the table, stopping right in front of Julian. You spineless coward, Sarah said. Her voice was shaking, but it was incredibly strong. Julian tried to step back, but my father still had a grip on his jacket. I bought my own clothes, Sarah told the room, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. I paid for my own meals. I paid his rent for the last 3 months because he said his accounts were temporarily frozen. She turned and looked directly at my mother, who was sobbing into her hands. He took your money, Evelyn. But do you want to know what he wanted to do with mine? Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. An ultrasound photo. She slammed it onto the table next to the mortgage documents. I'm pregnant, Sarah said, her voice cracking. The room gasped. Sarah turned back to Julian, her eyes burning with hatred. And for the last 2 weeks, he has been screaming at me, threatening me, trying to force me to get an abortion. He said a baby would ruin his aesthetic. He said he couldn't afford a kid right now. She let out a bitter, ugly laugh. You know why? Because he's been sleeping with the daughter of a real estate developer behind my back, trying to secure a handout from her father. He wanted me out of the way. Julian's mouth hung open. He looked around the room, desperate for a lifeline. He looked at Nathan. Nathan stared at the ceiling, pretending he wasn't there. He looked at my mother. She was shaking her head, backing away from him like he was a monster. Sarah, please, Julian begged. Sarah raised her hand and slapped him across the face. It was a vicious, open-handed strike that echoed like a gunshot. Julian stumbled sideways, holding his cheek. We are done, Sarah said. I am keeping the baby, and you are never coming near us. She grabbed her coat, walked past Mr. Carter, and walked out the front door. Carter looked at me. I believe my business here is concluded, Caleb. The funds will clear on Monday. I'll have my legal team contact yours to finalize the transition. Thank you, Mr. Carter, I said. Carter nodded, cast one last look of utter disdain at the ruins of my family, and walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The roar of the Porsche engine fired up, and then faded into the distance. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. The golden boy was completely exposed. The fake CEO, the perfect son, was a broke, cheating, fraudulent coward who was about to send his parents to the street. My father slowly let go of Julian's jacket. Julian collapsed into a chair, putting his head on the table and sobbing loudly. Nobody moved to comfort him, not even my mother. My father turned to me. His face was a mask of desperation. The arrogant, controlling patriarch I had known my entire life was gone. He looked old. He looked broken. He walked slowly toward me. He stopped a few feet away, his hands trembling. Caleb, my father said. His voice was a pathetic whisper. Caleb, please. I stood my ground, holding Chloe's hand. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel sad. I just felt completely empty. $50 million, my father said, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. Son, you have $50 million. The bank is going to take this house in 30 days. We'll have nowhere to go. Julian is going to prison for forgery. Please, you have to help us. A few $100,000 is nothing to you now. Family protects family. You know that. You've always been the good son. Please, Caleb. He actually started to bend his knees. He was going to kneel. Stop, I said sharply. He froze. He looked up at me, hope shining in his desperate eyes. Don't do that, I told him, my voice completely flat. Don't humiliate yourself, because it won't change anything. My father blinked. What do you mean? You have the money. You can fix this. I agreed. But I won't. My mother let out a loud wail from the corner of the room. Caleb, how can you be so cruel? We are your parents. I looked at her. You made your choice a long time ago. You chose the golden boy. You paid for his cheating. You forced me to take the fall for his drunk driving. You threw away my hardware. You called me a useless mechanic. And you, Dad, I turned back to my father. You stole my grandfather's cabin. And then you hit me. You hit me. And you told me I was nothing. I was angry, my father pleaded. I was stressed about the debt. I didn't mean it. Yes, you did, I said. And you know what the best part is? When you hit me, you told me I was no longer your son. You cut me out. You set me free. Caleb, please, my father begged, reaching a hand out toward my jacket. I stepped back out of his reach. I am not your son, I told him, repeating the exact words he had screamed at me. You are not my family. You are just people I used to know. I looked around the room one last time. At Uncle Matthew looking ashamed. At Nathan looking terrified. At Julian sobbing like a child. At my parents, realizing that the son they threw away was the only one who could have saved them. Goodbye, I said. I turned around, holding Chloe's hand, and walked out the front door. The cool November air hit my face. I took a deep breath. It smelled like rain and wood smoke. It smelled like freedom. 6 months later, the spring sun was shining through the massive oak trees surrounding Lakeview Ridge. The county had put my grandfather's cabin up for public auction exactly as I predicted. I didn't let the corporate developers get it. I sent my lawyers in with a cash offer that blew everyone else out of the water. I bought it back. Chloe and I spent the first 2 months of spring renovating it. We fixed the sagging roof. We replaced the rotting porch with strong, fresh cedar. I built a brand new dock leading out into the water. But we kept the soul of the place exactly the same. We kept his old rocking chair on the porch. We kept his old fishing rods mounted on the wall. I didn't stop there. I took a portion of the buyout money and established the Lakeview Foundation. It was a scholarship and mentorship program specifically designed for high school kids who were struggling, kids who didn't have supportive families, kids who loved taking things apart and building them back up in the dark. I wanted to make sure they knew someone saw their potential, even if their parents didn't. In May, Chloe and I got married. We didn't have a massive, extravagant wedding in a fancy hotel. We got married right on the wooden dock of the cabin, surrounded by the quiet water and the trees. Elijah was my best man. He stood beside me wearing a suit that actually fit him for once, holding the rings. Chloe walked down the grassy path looking like an absolute vision. The guest list was tiny. Mostly our close friends, some of our key employees from the old company, and Sarah. Sarah had reached out to me 2 months after Thanksgiving. She had moved to a different city and started fresh. She was showing a beautiful baby bump. We had coffee, and we forgave each other for the collateral damage of being tied to my family. There was only one blood relative of mine at the wedding, Aunt Clara. She sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue as Chloe and I exchanged vows. Clara had been the only one who called me after Thanksgiving to apologize for standing by silently all those years. She told me she was proud of me. After the ceremony, we set up long wooden tables on the grass for a barbecue reception. I was holding a cold beer, watching my friends laugh and talk as the sun began to set over the lake. I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Aunt Clara. She looked nervous, holding a glass of iced tea. "It's a beautiful wedding, Caleb," she said softly. "Your grandfather would have loved this." "I'm glad you're here, Aunt Clara," I told her. She took a sip of her tea and looked out at the water. "I feel like I need to tell you something. Something about your father. I debated telling you, because I know you've moved on. But I think you deserve the whole truth. The final piece of the puzzle." I leaned against the porch railing. "What is it?" Clara sighed heavily. "You remember the second mortgage? The one Julian forged?" "Hard to forget," I said. "Your father knew about it," Clara said quietly. I froze. "What?" "He looked completely shocked at Thanksgiving. He was shocked that you found out. He was shocked that the evidence was sitting on the dining room table," Clara explained. "But he knew Julian forged those papers 2 years ago." I stared at her, trying to process the magnitude of the lie. If he knew Julian forged his signature to steal $400,000 against his house, why didn't he go to the police? Why did he let him do it? Clara looked down at her hands. "Because your father had a gambling addiction, Caleb. A severe one. He owed a lot of money to some very bad people in the city. He couldn't take out a loan himself because his credit was already destroyed. When Julian forged the documents to get cash for his fake consulting lifestyle, your father caught him. But instead of turning him in, Robert made a deal with him." The pieces slammed into place. The sickening, horrific logic of it all. "He blackmailed his own son," I whispered. Clara nodded. "He told Julian he wouldn't press charges for forgery, but only if Julian gave him half of the mortgage money to pay off his gambling debts. They were in it together. Julian spent his half on fancy cars and fake businesses. Robert spent his half at the poker tables. But when the bank came calling to collect the monthly payments, neither of them had the cash. So they panicked, I realized. And they decided to steal Grandpa's cabin from me to cover their tracks. Yes, Clara said. Your father manipulated everyone. He manipulated your mother into thinking Julian was just having a bad business quarter. He manipulated Matthew into contesting the will. He played the victim at Thanksgiving because he didn't want Evelyn to know he was the reason they were losing the house too. I stood there, feeling the evening breeze wash over me. The final layer of the illusion was gone. My father wasn't a peacekeeper. He wasn't even just a blind enabler. He was a co-conspirator. He had traded his family's security, his wife's home, and my inheritance, just to fund his own dark habits. What happened to them? I asked. I hadn't checked on them in 6 months. I hadn't cared to know. The bank foreclosed on the house in February, Clara said sadly. They were evicted. Evelyn finally found out everything. About the gambling. About the blackmail. She filed for divorce. She's living in a tiny, subsidized social housing apartment across town now. She works the register at a grocery store. And Dad? He moved into a motel, Clara said. I don't speak to him anymore. None of the family does. He burned every bridge. And the golden boy? Clara shook her head. Julian fled the state before the bank finalized the fraud investigation. Nobody knows where he is. There's a warrant out for him. Evelyn cries about him every day, still convinced that Sarah ruined his life. I looked out over the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the orange and purple hues of the sunset. I thought I would feel a sense of triumphant vindication hearing about their downfall. But I didn't. I didn't feel happy that my mother was working a cash register or that my father was in a motel. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. Relief that I had walked away. Relief that I hadn't given them a dime. If I had bailed them out, they would have just kept lying, kept gambling, kept stealing. The rot was too deep. You can't save a burning house by throwing money into the fire. Thank you for telling me, Aunt Clara, I said. She smiled a sad, gentle smile. You built a good life, Caleb. You earned it. Later that night, after all the guests had gone home, Chloe and I stood on the porch of the cabin. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden dock and the crickets in the tall grass. Chloe leaned her head against my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around her, holding her close. I looked at the house I had rebuilt. I thought about the family I had left behind and the family I had chosen. Society tells us that blood is thicker than water. They tell us that we have to forgive our parents, our siblings, no matter what they do, because family is family. They make you feel guilty for walking away from toxic people, simply because you share the same last name. But I learned the hard way that blood doesn't make a family. Respect makes a family. Honesty makes a family. Loyalty makes a family. My father and my brother shared my blood, but they would have watched me drown if it meant they could use my body as a stepping stone. I had spent the first 25 years of my life begging for a seat at a table where I was only ever the punchline. I let them define my worth. I let them convince me that because I liked getting my hands dirty, because I didn't wear a suit, I was somehow less valuable. But the moment I stopped asking for their permission to be successful, the moment I stopped caring about their applause, I became untouchable. I built my empire in the dark. And when I finally brought it into the light, it was strong enough to shatter their entire fake reality. You cannot let the people who failed to see your value determine your price. You are the architect of your own worth. And sometimes the only way to build the life you deserve is to burn the bridge back to the people who kept you small. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long journey, and it wasn't an easy one to tell, but getting it out there feels like a massive weight has been lifted off my chest. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you've ever felt like the black sheep in your own home. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from people you loved to protect yourself? Let me know in the comments. And for those of you who stayed with me until the very last second, you are officially part of the 1% Club. Leave a comment with the letter W below. W stands for winner. That's our secret code. It lets me know who the real winners are, the amazing people who watch until the end and understand what it takes to survive the fire. If my story helped you, please hit that like button and follow the channel. We have a lot more real stories to share, and I want you to be part of this community. Stay strong, keep building your empire in the dark, and I'll see you in the next